The name of the book is Masaru, right?
Oh, you have it.
Yeah, I got it.
Yes, I have
Yes.
one too.
Super, super. All right, so let's start. Welcome to Long Island Catholic Apologetics. Having great
Thank
pleasure
you.
to have today Michael Cibenko, the author of the book Masaru, which is great, great book. And I want to talk about this book. I want to talk about being a Catholic Christian author, and maybe the whole process of creating the book and all this stuff. So we are meeting very first time. We just chat a little bit on the social media before, so we never met in person.
That's right.
My ministry is located on Long Island, New York. That's why it's called Long Island Catholic Apologetics. So whenever you're going to be on Long Island, feel invited. I always invite my
Thank you.
guests and friends to Long Island to come hang out and have a great time. And yeah, so we have a chance to kind of live get to know each other. So, well, first, how did you even come up with this idea to write a book? What kind of inspired you to do that?
Okay, well, since I was a child, I had an interest in Japanese culture and history. I myself am 1/4 Japanese. I have a Japanese grandmother, so I always had a goal to travel to Japan one day. And at university, I was able to study the language, and that led to a job teaching English in Japan. So I actually lived there for about 4 years. That was that was a great opportunity and a great experience.
Wow.
So I happened to live in the region. I was not in a big city like Tokyo. I was way in the far western part of the country, in the countryside, and I lived actually very close to Nagasaki in that area. And there's a very rich history of the church, particularly in that area, because that's the area where the first Christians arrived, St. Francis Xavier, in the late 1500s. And so there was a lot of history there. And so I was very interested in learning more about the history of the church, yeah, particularly in that region.
That is very interesting. So Japan has a very, very fascinating interplay with the Catholic religion, and so you had a chance to learn something. Like you mentioned Nagasaki, and I just cannot help to digress a little bit, because from what I learned, there was very big Catholic demographic in Nagasaki, and unfortunately, the bomb fell there, and that really diminished Catholic population in Japan, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting when you think about it. The areas that were targeted just happened to be areas with the most dense, Christian populations. I don't know if that's ironic. Went to the cathedral there for mass. You can still see signs, of the blast. You can see, for example, stone statues of the Blessed Mother, where the face was melted from the heat of the blast. Impactful things.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so let's go back to your story. We can go back to the Japan a little bit more later. So you have a little bit background. Your grandma was Japanese, and you had this calling to go there, and you stayed there for a number of years. You were teaching English, and are you a creator Catholic, or that you had some conversion on the way?
Yeah, so I was born and raised Catholic. I guess, like many of my generation, I had a kind of, I guess maybe somewhat of a falling away in my 20s. I never rejected the faith, but there was kind of a lukewarm period where I was not going to mass regularly, or availing myself of the sacraments. And actually, my time in Japan was a time during which my faith was sort of reawakened. I was, somewhat inspired by the Catholic population there, which is very small, but it's also very devout. And I remember going to mass for the first time in Japan, and I was very impacted by the reverence of the mass, and the devotion of the faith there.
That's fascinating. I think like a lot of people who are like really Catholic, they have that period that they kind of fall off from the faith, usually at around the college years, and they some at times return stronger. So that's not an uncommon thing, I would say.
Sometimes, yeah. It was very interesting going to mass, and for example, during the sign of peace, I sort of reflexively stuck my hand out to shake hands with neighbor, and they just sort of, respectfully bowed to me. And in some ways, the mass there is a little bit of like the Latin mass, just in terms of just the more sort of quiet reverence that was very typical, of mass there. So that was one of the things that inspired me.
So when you were there, you started studying the Catholic history on the islands, or were you already familiar somewhat with the missionaries going there earlier?
Yeah, not so much. I knew a little bit from things I had read, certain films that I had seen growing up. But on my most recent trip back, which has been more than 5 years now, I was able to visit what's called the Amakusa Christian Museum. And it's a museum that is dedicated to the history of Christianity in the region, and more specifically to what's today referred to as the Shimabara Rebellion, which was an uprising of persecuted Christian peasants and former samurai that was led by a young 16-year-old samurai convert. His name was Shiro Shiro Amakusa.
Oh, this is the same character, like I'm assuming that it's in your book, right? So I was gonna ask you, but since you're already here, so I was gonna ask you, are these characters the real characters? Did you base the story on the real people, or those are just made up characters?
Yes, so definitely the main character is based on the real Shiro Amakusa. He was the inspiration. Although I did change his family name in the book, I changed it to Shiro Nakagawa, which just happened to be the family name of my Japanese grandmother.
Oh, that's cool.
And I did this because, I thought that was kind of a personal touch. But I did this because this is a book of historical fiction, and I do take some liberties with, because there's really not all that much known about the real Shiro. And so for the purpose of storytelling, created a character based on what I imagined he might be like, someone growing up in that time. So yes, all of the characters and events are based on actual history, but it is a work of historical fiction. And so I do take a lot of creative liberty as far as the personalities and with some of the characters.
It's like a vehicle to go to the times of the story, and almost kind of like
absolutely,
like get immersed and get to know it. Like really, I read a bunch of books like placed in the Second World War, and that's how I learned a lot of history, like fiction, but the surrounding was real, like the setting, and that's how I think people who don't have inclination to learn history, then kind of you can cheat them into learning it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's actually it's my favorite genre of writing, because you get the best of both worlds. You get to learn history, but you also get to use your imagination, and so that it just seems to be the perfect vehicle for my story.
And you're really great at
So people who
doing.
read it, I mean, you will learn about the history. Yeah, so I do make that disclaimer that the events described in the book are based on real history. I do take some, some liberties as far as like the exact timing and even the exact location of the events. I changed them around a little bit, but as much as possible, I try to stay true to the picture and
Right.
the actual history of the
Right
church.
from the beginning in your book, there's a, I don't know if we're gonna see it, but there's a map. So you're
Yes.
showing the location of the events. What's the name? How you say it? Kyushu. That's the
Kyushu, yes, that is the southernmost of the four major islands. That's where I lived.
Oh, you live there, in this area. And I like how you give a little dictionary in the beginning, and you go right into it, the Japanese names and stuff. So it's like, okay, we go hardcore right into the culture. So that's really cool move, because it kind of challenges the reader to be focused on the text, because you put us in somewhere like, okay, that's not your familiar environment, but it's good because it really increases focus. So I like that.
I'm glad you said that, because that was a tricky thing. I tried to balance it. I wanted to be authentic and use actual names, and references to things.
And I think in general you're like very careful writer, because you make little connections and leeways between things that, like I initially, what I like really in this very beginning, when you start like the story of Shiro, you get these two quotes, one from the John and the other one from Japanese proverb about the wheat, right? So John says, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. And then you go to the Japanese proverb right under this: be like wheat, whereas the taller you grow, the lower you bow your head to the ground. And it's, you already built the bridge between the cultures, that there is some connection, even though you might not see it initially. So I like it a lot. It's like a kind of like a symbolism in it, but it's really good.
Yeah, I've read other books that use these sort of quotes at the beginning of a chapter, kind of create a certain mood. So I knew I wanted to do that, and I think you're right. I got the idea to use one quote from scripture and one from Japanese history, like did exactly what you said. Try to sort of bridge to create that connection between the two cultures.
Yes. And how did you learn to write like this? Because writing, it's not an easy process. You can write an essay or something, but writing a book, it's a long process. Do you have a background in English or something?
My major at university was English, and with the concentration in literature. I've always enjoyed writing from the time I was a kid. I enjoy writing stories, and yeah, it's certainly not easy. I certainly experience what most writers do, writer's block, or the frustration of, you have a wonderful idea in your mind, but to try to bring it into words is sometimes difficult. And I had to learn to just write freely, because sometimes I make the mistake of trying to write the perfect paragraph on the first draft, and that's almost never going to happen. So I just had to learn to just write and just let the ideas flow. And yeah, and then after that, it's a matter of a lot of revising, showing it to certain friends whom I trust to get some input. So yeah, there's a whole process that's involved that can be painstaking, but it's also very enjoyable, to see something that you've imagined to flesh it out into words, and hopefully something that other people can enjoy.
Right. And you did a really wonderful job on this. And for me,
Oh, thank you.
a lot of these things that you wrote there, it's almost like disguised apologetics. And I do apologetics. I lead apologetics ministry. So to me, it's very appealing. I love it.
Yeah, I think that because I taught theology for many years at a high school, and I know there were a lot of discussions that took place in the classroom, and I had to employ a lot of apologetics, like you said. And my idea was in writing this story, to try to see if I could get some of those lessons into the story in the form of dialogues between characters. And so a lot of the dialogues in those passages that you recognize as being sort of apologetic were inspired by actual discussions in the classroom that I had with students over the years.
So,
in discussing things.
You were teaching, right?
Yes.
And then you got involved with some conversations about the faith, and so you kind of like grew into apologetics like organically. You didn't study anything like theology or philosophy, right?
I guess I'm a self-study. I've done a lot of self-study over the years, but I have no formal degree in theology. Although I did teach it for many years at a Catholic high school, and realized that it wasn't enough to just believe things. I had to be able to articulate those things and to explain them to others. And so
you really like pronounce a lot of doctrines in such a simple way that it's so accessible. And those are not easy things, like, for example, there's this moment that I'm not sure, that I think that was the father of Shiro who was explaining it to the grandma. And he says, oh, I'm still learning all this stuff, but he says some things that are like, that's a Christian creed in a way. And that was cool. But okay, so I'm gonna treat you like an expert in Japanese culture and the Christian arrival in Japan. So can you give us a little picture of what happened? Because as far as I understand, Japanese was isolated for many years, and then there is this missionaries come, and initially they have great success, but then faith doesn't spread anymore. So what happened? Well, give us a little picture of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat complicated, and I think the book, I try to kind of show, what happened, the different phases that Christianity went through. But originally, the missionaries who arrived from Spain and Portugal were allowed to spread the faith in exchange for the use of their large ships to accommodate trade between Japan and mainland Asia. So that was a very nice, mutually beneficial arrangement. But the religion, it began to spread much more quickly than anyone would have anticipated. And so this became a concern for the authorities. Of course, there were also political issues, there was some concern that perhaps the empire, the Spanish Empire, had plans of conquest of the Japanese islands, and so this was also a concern. And so missionaries were eventually expelled. This was further complicated by the arrival of the Dutch, the Protestant Dutch, were able to sort of take the place in terms of the commerce arrangement. So the Japanese no longer relied so heavily upon the Spanish and Portuguese for trade. Now they were able to use these new partners, Dutch, and they were somewhat instrumental in helping to quell the rebellion that's described in the book. So once the faith was outlawed, it became very messy. There were many who were, all the converts were forced to publicly apostatize, and many did, although many did not. And those who did not, they suffered very grave consequences. And the rebellion that's described in the book was in response to the brutal persecutions that were taking place.
Which involved.
Now we also know that.
What was that persecution? Were they just not allowed to go to certain places, or they were stolen properties, or they were just like physical, like punishments and killings? What happened there?
Yeah, it was a gradual progression, or maybe so. In the beginning, it was mainly in the form of taxation, very heavy taxes that were placed on the Christian villages. For example, certain burial taxes, and just taxes that were not exacted upon the general population. But this later led to the confiscation of property, the outlawing of public worship, attending mass, and eventually this also led to arrests, torture, beheadings, public executions, and it's believed that the rebellion was prompted by probably several, not only just one specific incident, but there was one incident which a peasant's daughter was disfigured, was publicly disfigured, and this just reached a boiling point, a tipping point at which the peasants it was just too much to bear, and so and that was the birth of the rebellion.
That's interesting. So, okay, that's probably gonna be one of the harder questions that I'm gonna ask you today. I had an interview with the priest from Nigeria last year, and in Nigeria, there's ginormous persecution of Christians coming from Muslims, and there are beheadings. Right now, as we speak, there are people kidnapped, they are killed, they found bodies on the streets, they disrupt masses, and there are shootings. It's just tragedy and the world most of the time is silent about it. But I was talking to Father Ben, and we had a group that was like open meeting, and we asked him, so what do you guys do? How you resist this, terrorism? And he says, we just pray. We just take it and pray. And this story is like a great contrast to what happened in your story, because these people, they are like, okay, we want to fight back. And I wonder, like, that's kind of philosophical, but which one is really the way? And the way is like
right.
Important word in Japanese culture. But yeah, like I cannot make my mind, like, because on one hand, church encourages us to give the other cheek, but also there's that concept of the just words, and there's kind of like dynamic between these two.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I guess that's one thing I want the reader to maybe think about for themselves. Um, it's certainly, and I think there may be parts of the book that sort of address that issue of, is it right to raise arms against your persecutor? And in this particular case, it wasn't that the Christian army did not seek conquest or vengeance. They were really just trying to protect their own, specifically women and children amongst them. And so what they did is they seized control of an abandoned castle to sort of give themselves a means of protection, and they were sieged upon. So it wasn't so much that they were seeking to be the aggressors, so much as to sort of to physically defend themselves. But yeah, that's a very good question that you raise. What is the correct response, the Christian response in those circumstances? And I think you'll see that in the book, Shiro is kind of a reluctant leader. He's not someone who's seeking glory or is bloodthirsty, but there's a certain reluctance in him to take up arms. But yeah, I hope that the reader can kind of think about that question and make come to their own conclusions.
Well, that's definitely a good question, because the persecution of Christians did happen in history many times. It's still happening, like I just mentioned, for example, in Nigeria and then many other places. So it's a real problem. And I think many people have to, even on the personal level, like, what do? You just take it, or you just stand up to it. And
Sure.
I think there are times that God might call to either one. It just takes a lot of discernment and wisdom. So that's well, I just love that the story kind of like stimulates to think about this stuff. So that's really good. But so let's go a little back in history. Because I also heard, I was listening to this lecture of this professor, like, who knows the Japanese culture, and he said that Japan, before arrival of Europeans, was very pagan. And although we have this kind of understanding of this culture of samurai and all that, but they had also like many pagan just habits, that I don't know a lot of it, but he mentioned stuff like there were children sacrifices at times. They were walking naked on the street. They didn't have like what we consider like maybe like more civilized way of living, but I don't know how much of that is true. I just heard it once in that short lecture. So can you tell anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I hear there are many examples of that. I mean, it is true that even prior to the arrival of Christianity, you did have the widespread practice of Buddhism, which had arrived in Japan many centuries earlier from India and China. But yeah, certainly it was a pagan culture, and one might argue that it still is in some ways, in many respects. For example, there was the practice of homosexual relations amongst samurai, with young boys, for example, and that's something I actually mention very briefly. I touched upon that in the book without going into any sort of graphic detail. But yeah, for sure, and it's an interesting question about pagan versus civilized. I guess it's true that a society can be civilized in some respects, perhaps, and yet be pagan in others. It's an interesting question. But certainly, with the arrival of Christianity, there were many challenges that were placed upon the sort of normal modes of everyday life, and I think that's one of the things that was seen as threatening. The Christianity was not a religion that was just some passive religion that could be contained in one little geographic area by its nature, because the truth is like a light. It has to spread. And so that the nature of Christianity was something that was perceived as a threat, because it couldn't just be contained the way that the authorities thought that it could be in the beginning.
Right, right. But that's interesting how you put it, like about civilized and pagan, because I did think a lot about it, and that's actually from apologetics. I think it's important point that, you know, we tend to look about the ancient traditions, like even Rome or Greece, if that was like, you know, the cradle of civilization, and they had this wonderful thing, like they come up with democracy, but we forget that the same people who came up with democracy, they have thousands of slaves, and they were treating them without dignity, you know. So that's not very
Sure.
civilized way of living, you know. They could come up, they might have some good ideas, but well, that might be controversial to many people, but I think Christianity really brought, like, that's really enlightenment, you know, in many ways, and that brought freedom to many people.
Absolutely, yeah. But it certainly
and I also
did challenge.
Yeah, continue, please.
Yeah, no, I was going to say there were certain challenges that presented with the arrival of Christianity, and those who adopted the faith were willing to make these sort of fundamental changes in their lives. And I think today, even today, I think that even though the Christian population is very small, there is still a level of devoutness there that is hard not to admire. You know, when Christianity was outlawed and all of the missionaries were expelled, you know, for 300 years, there were no priests and no sacraments. And yet, when Christian missionaries came back, you know, 300 years later, they found these communities, these hidden underground Christian communities that had still managed to pass along the faith all those generations, you know, even without, you know, the mass, without the priesthood. So that also, I think, is a testament to the, you know, the level of devotion.
Right. Yeah, that's really incredible, that this preservation of faith. And I heard that one of the reasons why the Christianity kind of died off there in a way is that they couldn't establish bishops, and that's why they couldn't have more priests, and that was the big problem. But, you know, like, what do you think? Because, you know, that just the setting of your book, Japan, this is like so different culture than American, and my background is European, so that's also very different. And you know, like, there are these missionaries going from Spain and from Portugal, right? You said in Dutch, and they are telling the story. That's not even European story. That's the story that happened in Israel, right? And what these people in Japan might find attractive in the life of a guy who lives somewhere in the Galilee, so not related in so many ways, and their religion is consisting of many deities and tradition and ancestral, I guess, respect and all that, and then the Buddhist spirit. What did they find so attractive? Why it was so appealing to them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think I try to address that question even in the book, like with certain conversations and dialogue, like you mentioned, between Shiro's father and the grandmother. You know, the grandmother, she doesn't understand why the father, who's converted to Christianity, why he would find this religion appealing, because it is, on its surface, on its face, it's kind of bizarre. You know, you have this religion where you're worshiping this image of a man who's been crucified. You know, that kind of, there's this paradox there, right? That's not a symbol of victory, right? You would think that's a symbol of defeat. So recognizing the paradoxical nature of this faith is maybe not something that's obvious from the beginning. But I guess that's a good question you ask, and I suppose we could ask that even
because when you say that, I'm just thinking like that culture of samurais and all that. There's this whole, I would say, code of like there's a warrior code, right? There's fight. You have to fight to the end, and if you get defeated, they were rather taking their own lives rather than get defeated. So that's super contrary to Japanese values.
Right. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
There's Jesus who does it like voluntarily.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think that's a very complex question that you ask. I think for many, it was the idea of salvation, and that this life does have a purpose and meaning, and that there is a supreme being who is not only a God of power, but also of love. And so, yeah, I mean, there were many elements of the faith that I'm sure, but I know for the character in the book, for Shiro, a lot of it had to do with the intellectual stimulation. There was so much about the faith that he found stimulated his intellect, because it's a faith that is based on not just sort of blind belief in something that's fantastical, but actually read and we can know the things of the faith through our human reason and intellect first and foremost, and then that can develop into what we refer to as faith. So I think that, at least for the character in the book, and for maybe many others, and myself included, that the appeal of the faith has a lot to do with the intellectual component, as well as the other aspects.
Yes, and even just the fact that we can talk and debate about this stuff right now, that speaks to that. That's very intellectual.
Sure.
Like, for example, like the Muslims, they don't discuss their faith. It's just, it is what it is. That's it. There's just just this simple. But you hinted something else. So you hinted that the idea of salvation was so attractive. So I'm assuming that the Buddhism doesn't really offer the afterlife vision or anything like that to the people. It's a missing part. I guess.
Yeah,
even,
I mean,
yeah.
I'm not an authority on Buddhist beliefs. I do have some exposure to that religion, but there you have the incarnation and karma, and sort of being locked into a certain level of, as far as what you can become in the next life, which is quite different from the Christian understanding of heaven and hell. And there's one, we are one unique spirit, and we are in this life, one time and one time only. We're just pilgrims in this world. And that the idea of reincarnation is ultimately a lie.
Right. I actually, we had this debate. One of the I host the monthly meetings of the apologetics men's group on Long Island. So if you ever around, come by. It's always last Friday of the month, and we talk about a lot of apologetic topics. And one time we were talking about like karma versus Christianity, and like, to me, the idea of having just one shot at life, that's very stimulating thing. But if you think that you can be reborn and reborn and reborn, like, you have just one chance, and you got to do the best out of it. And I think it's very stimulating.
Sure. Yes, it's certainly puts a very different perspective on things.
Yes. And did you learn some Japanese there? Do you speak? Can you communicate with people like in their language?
Hi. Yes, I had actually studied for a couple of years at college, and then so when I arrived there, I could speak already a little bit, but certainly having lived there for 4 years, I learned a lot because I really where I lived in the countryside were very few people who could speak English, and so I really had to speak it every day just for everyday communication and survival. So yeah, I got to the point where I would say I'm proficient. I don't like to say I'm fluent because fluent to me means on a level as a native speaker. Still learning every day a little bit, but yeah, I feel pretty good about my speaking abilities. The reading and writing is a whole other thing that is a big challenge. But yeah, that was one of the reasons I wanted to go in the first place. Is I wanted to learn the language. I'm very interested in language in general.
So the Christianity in Japanese, I don't know if I get it right. It's Kirishitans, or I said it wrong.
No, you got that right. Yeah, Kirishan is the actual word for Christian, and Kiristo Kyo is the word for Christianity. Referring to the religion.
Huh. Do you still have relatives there?
And Catholic is simply Catholic. I actually do. I have my grandmother had a brother in Tokyo, and I was able to contact him, and I actually visited him in Tokyo. So that was kind of neat to be able to meet that side of my family for the first time.
That's cool. That's very cool. So
and of course now I have friends. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. You definitely once you spend there some time, you definitely develop some connections and friendships. So now there's no persecution of Christians anymore. It's a relatively free country, very modern. They are very technologically advanced. And how is the demographic? Like, what's the main religion? Are the people atheists or believers in any faiths? How the modern society looks like?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I know that now Christianity constitutes perhaps 2% of the overall population. That number is higher in certain areas. My experience was that people don't give a whole lot of thought to the hereafter, and so I guess it might be fair to say that there's a certain kind of atheism that runs through that culture.
It's really like I think Western. I guess I don't know if we can consider Japanese Western, but the modern, very modern, advanced and wealthy cultures, they have very high secularism. They are not so interested in faith so much. There's interesting.
That's right. One could argue that we have become very secularized in many respects. As a regime as a whole, and maybe we might be going the way of, you referred to ancient Rome. They might be headed down that same path.
Yeah, so we'll see how that goes. But definitely people like you who write books like that, definitely like that can be transforming to some people. And I can just imagine, I don't know, maybe you tell me, like, did you ever have somebody who told you that they just got it just because they were interested in Japan, and they got introduced to the Christian faith? Did you ever have it happen to you?
Yes, actually, I have. Yes, I have had a few people who bought the book just because they're interested in Japanese. At least we'll have something to think about.
Yes, yeah. And then just like we spoke earlier, that it is intellectually stimulating, and I think the conversion, it very rarely it's like dramatic conversion. Usually it takes time, it's a process. So sometimes we're just
Sure.
adding a little brick to that construction.
I have been thinking about perhaps writing a follow up to Masaru that deals with the subject of the hidden Christians after Christianity was banned. Those Christians that mentioned earlier who still practiced the faith as best they could under those circumstances. So I've thought about perhaps a novel dealing with that subject. I think that would be kind of an interesting story about how people were able to practice the faith and keep that secret from the authorities.
Right, underground life. And I know something about it because so I'm from Eastern Europe, from Poland, and in Eastern Europe, the church was really persecuted at the time of the communism, and in certain places was really heavily persecuted. So people even had like baptism, like at somebody's house, hiding and all that. And even more so in further east, like Ukraine and then Belarus and these countries, they almost eliminated faith from there. And I know my friend from Ukraine, he said like he was baptized at somebody's home in hiding. And
wow,
that's recent history. So that's really fascinating. And it still just speaks how important that was to people. And so just practical question. So how long it takes to write a book like this?
So I guess from the time I started, I remember I was in the public library in Hackensack, and I wrote the first paragraph or so that day, and I guess from start to finish, it took about a year. And there were, and it was not. There were phases. Like there were some weeks when I wrote, many hours a day, and then there were some weeks when I kind of put it away for a little while. I guess from start to finish was about 1 year. I'm not sure how many hours that was. I should have kept a log of how many hours. But yeah, it was a year.
It's a lot of work. Definitely.
And it was, it was a lot of work. And at times it was a lot of fun and very rewarding. Sometimes it was frustrating. That was a goal that I had for many years, and so that was very satisfying to just finally achieve that.
The book that I have, it says it was, I guess, printed in 2021. Is that the year where you wrote it, or yeah?
So I started writing in 2020, and about Christmas time, I think it was about Christmas time of 2020, I got notified by the publisher, Arcs Publishing, that they were interested in that book. They actually the publisher was he had specifically looking for a book that deals with Christianity in Asia. And so it was just kind of a coincidence, or maybe not coincidence, maybe providence,
right?
That that I just happened to send him a manuscript that dealt with that subject.
That's
really... and then it came out, and then there, it took some time. It takes several. Actually, it took a few months between the publisher accepting the book and the process of printing it and distributing it and all that takes time. So there were a few months between finishing the book and actually seeing it in print.
Right. So also, did you get somebody like a person who was like, hey, this publishing house, they want to have somebody writing about Asia, and they knew you and they kind of connected you? How did that work?
No, so when I wrote the book, I said, okay, now I have this book. Now what do I do with it? I wasn't sure what to do, so I sent it to, different publishers, and I looked specifically at Catholic publishers because I knew that was probably the audience that was going to be more interested, maybe, than others. But it was challenging because a lot of Catholic publishers only publish nonfiction, like biographies of saints, prayer, devotional books, those kind of things. There's really not a lot of there aren't a lot of publishers that deal with fiction, and this was one of the few, one of a handful. Arcs Publishing, they're located in New Jersey, actually not far from Philadelphia. Yeah, I contacted them directly, and I wasn't expecting a response or a positive response. I just was expecting them to say, "Well, thank you, but we're not accepting anything at this time." But he wrote me and said, "Yeah, this is I'm interested in this subject," and he read the first, I guess, 2 or 3 chapters I sent him, and he liked it, and he said, "Send me the rest." And then, and then we worked together to get it finished.
And how do you promote the
book? But it was a long process, and it could be,
Is the publishing house promoting the book, or you try to do it on your own? How does that go?
Yeah, I mean, it's a small publisher, so they don't have access to, huge, expensive marketing campaigns. So it's really just sort of word of mouth. They do promote it like at certain events they attend. They promote the book. They have it on the website. But really, it's just been like talking to people like yourself, who are willing to, ask me questions and talk about it and share it with other people. So yeah, it's been kind of a low level, grassroots kind of marketing. Although I think they are. I understand that he's hiring a marketing coordinator, so maybe things will get a little bit more. Yeah, maybe there'll be some more market in the coming months.
Right. But well, I read few reviews of your book, and all of them were really high up. Like one was like out of 5 stars, you got like 4.25, 4.5, like really good reviews. And I guess those are just the readers, but not even just the readers. I'll tell you, like even like, let me see what page I was looking at. One was Goodreads, one was Deeper Truth blog, and they had really good recommendation in regards to your book.
Yes, yeah, I've been very fortunate. I mean, people have responded positively. There was a very nice review that was written up in the New Oxford Review, which is a very good, very solid Orthodox publication.
It maybe speaks also to that there's a void for this type of literature, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I hope that maybe other publishers will maybe think about the opening up more opportunities for this kind of, yeah, I guess you could call it Catholic fiction, where, through good storytelling, we can kind of reveal certain truths about the faith.
Do you think, is there like much of a difference being Catholic author rather than secular author? Or it's more like a genre thing?
I guess for me, when I wrote the book and talking about things related to the faith, but I wanted to do it in a way that anybody, a non-Catholic, an atheist, anybody could read it and and get something out of the book and be able to enjoy it on some level. I wasn't trying to sort of, preach, you know, through the book, but rather to use, dialogues with the characters to, yeah, to sort of reveal certain things about the faith and about truth. But yeah, I was mindful as I was writing that I wanted it to be something that anybody could enjoy on some level, and hopefully that's true.
Well, I think you did it very, very good. And exactly like you said, there's no preaching tone in it. It's just so organic, like as if you were just a witness of some conversation somewhere. And I think that's just how it works in life also.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right.
So I guess we're going to be wrapping up, but the one of the focal points in I guess in the context of the whole story is like when the Francis arrives in Japan. Do you know a lot about his arrival, how he was received? And also, did they know Japanese when they arrived? How did they communicate?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So Francis, when he arrived, he did have companions with him who did speak the language, so he was able to work through interpreters. But it was a challenge. It was a challenge to try to explain these ideas, because for many things there was no word. There was no word. For example, the word that was used for the Christian God, initially they used the word Dainichi. Well, it turned out that word was also a word that was used for one of the Buddhist deities. So there was a confusion there, that the people originally thought that he was making reference to one of the Buddhist deities, but so there were just certain language barriers that had to be overcome for sure. But eventually they did. It took some time.
That was pretty bold. And then later, from my background, Maximilian Kolbe arrives in Japan. But that's recent times, modern history. I believe he might have been in one of the cities that was bombed, actually. That might have been Nagasaki.
I think that you're right. Yes.
Maximilian Kolbe, when he was in Nagasaki, he wanted to build a house fraternity for his brothers, and they had two offers of the properties, and then one was like somewhere in the mid city, and one was like further behind. And he had a vision, and he said, like, we're not buying this one because the ball of fire gonna fall here. And he bought the other property, and apparently was mostly spared from the destruction.
Oh wow!
But that's just the legend.
Yeah, I didn't know that story.
Maybe if you know people there, you can ask them if they know anything more about it, because that's really fascinating motif.
Oh yes, I didn't know that story. That is amazing.
Is there an established bishop in Japan? Like, is there like any cardinals? Like, because you said it's small percentage, like 2%, but still they have like 100 million people, right, or something like that. So that still makes a number.
Sure. Yes, I mean they do have. There's one bishop in Tokyo, and yeah, I think that I was maybe it was Providence that the area that I went to. When I went to that specific part of Japan, it was really because I just wanted to be in the countryside where I would be forced to speak a language. It wasn't really because that was the area that had all of this rich history of the church. I only learned about that really after my arrival. So that was, maybe that was some form of providence that led me to that particular country. Because otherwise, I'm sure that I would not have gotten the idea for this book. It was really living so close to the place where the actual events occurred.
Wow. This is just a fascinating story in itself. You have really cool story going, spending a few years in Japan, learning the culture, connecting with your roots, and getting inspired to write this beautiful book. So that's really fascinating. I'm definitely gonna bring. We don't have like a huge ministry, but I have like a little following here on Long Island with some people who come to my meetings mostly, and we talk apologetics. I'm definitely gonna recommend this book. It's a really good read, and thank you for making time for this conversation. And I hope we're gonna make some more in the future. Maybe we're gonna talk more about Japanese culture, maybe about your future endeavors with writing.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope to. I'll have to come to Long Island to pay you a visit.
Yes, so definitely invited. You can stay at my place if you want, and then we can go on to do one of the meetings. So feel invited.
Excellent.
All right. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you. Mike. Thank you so much. We'll be wrapping up.
Sayonara.
Oh, sayonara. Thank you so much.